Hi, hello, how are you? Craig Chapman here, and welcome to Brutally Roll Your Own Backend, a short video series on writing your own low-cost backend for a Delphi application. Welcome to part 9. In this part, we're going to take a look at adding some error handling to our CRUD class, and depending on how far we get, maybe we'll add in some additional CRUD methods as well. Now, before we get started, there's a number of little things that we need to discuss. So first of all, during the recording of parts 8 and 9, I had some problems with my recording software. Essentially, the software kept on pausing and wasn't recording anything. Now, I don't know if this was the software misbehaving or if it was a lapse in concentration on my part. I know which is more likely, but I'm going to choose to blame the software. Anyway, I was able to edit part 8 back together, which I put up on my blog yesterday. But I decided to start over recording part 9. Now, for this reason, there are some code refactorings and changes in the code that you won't have seen me do in real time. But they are minor, and I'm going to review them with you before we continue. So that'll be the first thing we get on with today after I talk about our source code. So a number of you have requested that I open the source code for you to download. And originally, I wasn't going to do this until the video series was complete, but I've decided to go ahead and open the source code early. So if I do miss anything in the code review, you can go grab a copy of the source and that'll help you to fill in the blanks. Now, before we do get started, I'd like to discuss the source code with you real briefly. So the URL, which you can see at the bottom of the screen there, links to a page on my blog. It's a tiny URL for this page. So on this page, we have the source code, and we also have the content with the listings for each of the videos as they're released. So I'm just going to read this to you. I know you can read yourself, but I'm going to read this just because I want to make this quite clear. So as I've mentioned previously, the project that we're building in this video series is being built in real time with the videos. This is unprepared, unscripted, off-the-cuff coding, and I had originally considered not releasing any of the videos until they were complete. And even when I decided against that, I began releasing videos as they were recorded, but I had still not planned to release the source code until the series was done. Because of your requests, I decided to open it early, but please consider the following. The source code is incomplete. It might change quite a lot between now and the end of the series, or if I should take a turn in the project and go down a different route, there might be dramatic changes, so watch out for that. The sources might also be a little out of sync with the videos at times, so if I'm still editing a piece, then before I post that on my blog while I'm doing the editing, the source code might be ahead, or the source code may fall a little bit behind if I do any kind of research or prep work, so just be aware of that. And the server that I'm using, it's a temporary server. It's going to be decommissioned when I've finished recording the series, and its passwords are not the same as they were set in the video series. However, there is at least one password, which is the MySQL database password, and a couple of API keys that are hard-coded into the source. Now, I don't want to maintain two source code versions for this video blog, and so I'm going to leave those as is. But I'm going to request that before you use this source code, go ahead and change the passwords and API keys, and obviously the server URL. Please don't work against the server that I'm working against. If anything happens there, I mean, you can't really do too much damage by accidentally putting in a location or two or something like that. But if any damage happens there that threatens to derail the video series, then I'm just going to have to commission a new server and freeze the source code so that that stops happening. So please play nice with others. Now, the source code can be found at my repository here. This is a public Subversion repository, and I know that some of you may not have used Subversion before, so I'll do a very brief introduction to Subversion. You'll need a client. Now, Rad Studio has a client built in, but if you're new to Subversion, then I would recommend using Tortoise SVN because it is the most intuitive that I've found. Also, the built-in Rad Studio Subversion, while it's perfectly capable, it really is designed for pulling in Delphi projects, and we have code outside of the Delphi projects in the PHP, for example. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you use Tortoise SVN. It's the one that I prefer using on Windows at least. So if I click on this link, we'll be taken to the Tortoise SVN download page. Obviously select the download that's appropriate for your operating system. Download that file, it's an installer, run through that and install it. And what that will do is it will put some new menu items in your context menu. Let me show you here. So if I create a new folder, let's call it Notifier. When I right click on this Notifier folder, I have this Svn Checkout option. So I'm going to go ahead and click that and I'll get a dialog. And you can see that I already have the Subversion link posted in the top here, and this is going to check out to C Notifier. So if I click on OK, the source code will download. It happened real quick there. And now if I go into the Notifier directory, you can see that I have the PHP and the Delphi sources. Now all of the paths in the source code are relative, so this should open and build. You should be able to just open the project file and build it. So there shouldn't be any issues there, but if there are, go ahead and leave comments or feel free to email me and we'll try and get those figured out for you. Now, when you want to update the source code to the latest version, come back to the folder that you have the source code in, right click, and you'll see that you now have SVN update. So if you click on update, it's just going to bring up a new dialog where it will update to the latest version of the code. Okay, so with that done, let's go ahead and get started with the code review. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the changes that I've made to our application. And we can start over in, let's see, in the CRUD client standard unit. So the first thing I did in here, I'm not really a fan of anonymous methods. I think they kind of look unreadable, and so I wanted to pull them all out of our code. So let's go and take a look at the read method that we were working on previously. The read method now does nothing more than create a task and call this internal read all. So what that's doing is, instead of having an anonymous method here making our REST call, it's calling this method on the class, this internal read method. And then of course I'm calling start to start the task. So if I go and take a look at the internal read all, you can see now that the code is pretty much as we had it before. It's a call to the REST client, but it doesn't have to be wrapped in an anonymous method, and it can be kept relatively small. I've also changed the calls which fire our events. So to fire the read start event, I'm calling a method do read start. And then to fire the success event, I've got do read success. Now remember that this internal read all is effectively going to be running in its own thread. And so inside of do read start, I have this tthread.synchronize, and I'm calling the event handler within the synchronize call, so effectively going back to the main thread to call this. Okay, and what I've done is for each of the possible events, I've created a do function. So do create fail, do create success, do create start, read, update, and delete doing the same thing. So that's just made the code a little bit more manageable, and the only anonymous methods are those in the do functions. And these are like 6 lines of code, so this just keeps the slightly unreadable anonymous methods to a minimal amount of code there. Okay, I've also added some things to the CRUD client interface. What I've added is get base URL, set base URL, get endpoint, set endpoint, get API key, and set API key. You can probably imagine what these are for. We've got 3 properties here: base URL, endpoint, and API key. These are the parameters that we're setting up on our CRUD class. Now if I go and take a look at the implementation here, we still have our construct, which still has the same 3 parameters, and we're setting those in the constructor as we always have done. We're just setting the internal members for each of those properties. So that hasn't changed, but what has changed is, because we've added these getters and setters, I can now go and change the get the endpoint or set the endpoint at any time during running, get the base URL, set the base URL. So at any time I can go and change those parameters. Now the real reason that I added those is specifically for the endpoint property. because our main form was previously set up. Let me switch to the source here. It was previously set up to instance just one iCRUD client. And as you can see, I now have two. I've got the regions client and the locations client. Now, in order to handle these clients properly, without being able to determine which endpoint is calling an event, I would have needed to have a copy of all of the event handlers for each of these endpoints, for each of these CRUD clients. So I didn't want to do that. I want to have handle create start work on either the regions client or the locations client. And the way that we do that, if I go and take a look at, let's say, handle read success here. So obviously I'm still calling the animation ends to end the read operation, but then I'm taking a look at the sender being, if we look at the call in here, so where is read success? Do read success. So in do read success, you'll remember I'm calling the handler here, I'm passing in self. So I'm passing in the instance of the CRUD client that we're using. And so that's what we're getting as sender, is the instance of the CRUD client that we're using. So if we are receiving a read success event from the regions endpoint, then this is going to be the instance of the regions endpoint which comes through. And I can now address this endpoint property to figure out which endpoint it is. Remember, this is a string, and in this case, if we imagine we're calling this from the regions endpoint, then this endpoint string would read regions. Now I moved that into a constant, C regions endpoint, and the reason I did that is when I create the endpoint, I'm using the same constant as when I compare it down here. So typos aren't going to be an issue, case sensitivity is not going to be an issue, because we're using the same constant to create the endpoint as we're using to identify it when the event handler fires. Now, I then moved the code which copies the results of the read call into this copy regions to form method. And all that does is clear our list regions, check that we actually have some results in the array, and then the loop that you've seen before loops through the regions and posts them as objects onto the items array. So that's pretty much the height of the changes. However, we have also changed the form create. So instead of creating fcrud client here, which we were doing before, I'm now creating two. So I've named them fregion's client and flocations client, and I'm calling this method which creates the endpoint. So you'll remember before we had create crud. Well, we're still calling that inside of this method, which is create crud endpoint, and we're passing the same parameters in. So if I go take a look at create crud endpoint, all it does is use the same parameters that we pass in to call create crud. So that's going to create our instance, and then it's setting the event handlers for whichever crud endpoint we're creating here. It's going to set the event handlers to our handle create, handle success, and so on. So going back to the form create, you can see I've got the regions and the locations clients are both being constructed using the same method. The only difference is the constant that we're using to name the endpoint. And then I'm calling the read function on the regions client. But both of these are sharing the same event handlers, which is why we use the code that I just showed you to identify the difference between them. Now, on the form itself, I've added this locations group box, a locations list box, and a panel which I'm going to put some buttons into later. And these are aligned in more or less the exact same way as the boxes for the regions list box. In fact, in exactly the same way, except that the locations group box is aligned to client. So this is where we're going to pull it out, and I've actually made this code function somewhat. It's not complete. Let's go take a look at what it does. So we've got our North Austin, South Austin, and East Austin regions coming out here. And we can think of regions, again, if we go back to our original example of this mobile food truck application, we can think of these regions as the routes that the food truck will operate on. And I've gone and put a location into our database just called some location. Now what I'm not doing yet is I'm not decoding the the PKID of the item that I click on. And so regardless of which item I click, I'm going to get the some location. Now this location is actually associated with the North Austin region. It shouldn't come up when I click on South Austin, but you'll remember that we don't have filters in our read method at this point. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that code works and add in the filters at this point. Oh, one more thing I should mention before we go any further. Since releasing the source code, I've added this config.inc file to the project. We're calling this in our main form, we're just including it, and it contains the URL that our endpoints are on and the API keys. So if you want to change the configuration of your application so that you're not using the same server, come in here and alter these values, and that'll change that function for you. Okay, so we're going to go and take a look at, let's see what happens when we click on a region in the regions list box. Now we have an event handler on change for the regions list box. So I'm going to go ahead and click into that, and I've already put a little code in here. So this event fires whenever the user clicks on a region in the regions list box. And what will happen is that list box control has an item index property. So if you call or retrieve the value of list regions.itemIndex, then what you're effectively getting is the index of the item which is selected in the list box. So that's what I'm doing here. And then using that index to look in the regions array. So we're looking in the items in the list box, and you'll remember that we encoded data into the objects part of that array. So I'm grabbing that object out. Now that object isn't actually an object. That is a PKID. So at this point, why am I checking the assignment? I'm sure I had a reason for doing that when I wrote this. I'm going to go ahead and delete that code out. So at this point, we have our object reference, which isn't actually an object. You'll remember the little hack that we were talking about in part 8, where we converted an object to a native integer. Well, this is where we need to reverse that. So I have this PKID, which is a native int, and I'm taking the object, remembering that an object under the hood is just a pointer, I'm casting it as a pointer, and then because the native int is the same size as a pointer, I can cast that back to an integer. And so what I get here is the PKID of the selected item in the list box. The one check I should put in here, actually, I'll go ahead and add this now, is this item index could be, it could be any value, but it could also be a negative value. So basically, if the user clears the selection from the list box, then what's going to happen is the item index will become -1 because an item in the index is not selected. So what we'll do is we'll check if list regions index is list regions item index is greater or equals 0, then let's reverse that. If it is less than 0, then begin. Now if the user has cleared the list box selection, then we don't need any locations appearing. So we'll say listbox locations.items.clear, and then we're going to exit out of this function because we're not going to fetch new locations for a region that doesn't exist. So then we get the object and we decode that back into a PKID, and we call the locations client to read the locations from the database. Now, again, we're calling this without a filter. I'm going to go ahead and check that the little changes I just made did not break anything. So if I click on North Austin, I get some location, South Austin, East Austin, and that all looks good. So let's go ahead and add filters at last to our read method. So if I come into the CRUD client, I actually realized that we could potentially do this a little bit better. So we're calling read, and we have another version of read for read all. But if I were to just pass in 0 filters, no filters, to this method, then this could perform both functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out our read method at this point, and we no longer need to overload it. Now I also use t-strings, and I've had second thoughts about this, so I'm going to change this to, let's go and create a new data type. I'm going to create t array of string is equal to array of string. Now what that means, let's get the caps right, so I don't need this classes library anymore. We have this t array of string type, and I'm going to use an array of strings as our filters. So we need to go and fix this up on the implementation of this interface. I'm going to take a copy of this method and come over to our implementation. Now what I'm going to do here is take a look at our read methods. We don't need read anymore. We're using this read with filters, and I'm just going to paste our header in. I'm then going to go and search for the read method. So here's our read method, and I'm going to take this one out because this no longer exists, and we're going to modify this one to match the header. So filters t array of string. Okay, so now we have this call which should get an array of strings which are our filters, and internally we're calling internal read all. Well, this prototype has no parameters, and I believe that's what t-task needs. So we may have to put our anonymous method back in here, but let's go ahead and try this first. We're just going to pass filters as a parameter to the internal read all. And then we need to go modify our internal read all. Internal read all, there we go. And we'll modify the header here to have the filters parameter, and of course put that in the header as well. So now if we were to run this at this point, it should basically ignore the filters altogether because we're not passing any in and we're not using them in the method. Let's go ahead and see if it builds, because I want to see if that anonymous method needs to change. Yes, it does. Okay, so what we're going to do here is procedure begin. We're going to call our internal read all. There's too many brackets in there. End and close the anonymous method. And I believe that should do it. Let's give that a try. Okay, fregents.read. So fregents.read is now expecting a parameter, and that parameter is our filters. But I'd like the option to call read without filters completely, so I don't have to change this. So let's go and take a look again at the interface, and what we'll do is we will pass in a default empty array like this. And I know that I don't need to, but I'm going to go ahead and put this on our implementation call as well. So we'll say that. Now that should build. And yes, it does. And you can see that we've effectively made no change here. Okay. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and implement the use of these filters, which is now on our internal read all method. Okay, so we've got the filters coming in here, and actually let's go ahead and, well, an empty array coming in here would be fine. So where we have the parameters here, we can go ahead and add in our filters if there are any. So what we'll do is we'll say if the length of the filters array is greater than 0, then begin. And we're going to loop through each of the filters in the array. I'm going to use a regular for loop for this, for IDX 0 to pred, and we'll do length of filters. Okay, that means we need an IDX control variable, uint32. Right, so what we'll do here is we'll start a string, filter equals, so that's the parameter name for our parameter, and then we'll add in filters IDX, so that will be the field name, conditional operator, and the value that we're comparing. That means that we need a string variable, and then we're going to pass that in. So we'll do with, actually I didn't need to put the name on that string. Don't need to do that. So we're basically going to copy this, and we're going to say name is filter, and then the value is from the filters array. Okay, so that should pass in our filters. And I did have a question on my blog, which I answered in the comments when we were building the PHP script. Can we use multiple filters since I'm no longer using filter 0, filter 1, and so on? And the answer is yes. The HTTP protocol will let you use multiple parameters, get or post variables by the same name. So we're going to set filter equals several times within this loop, and we can use as many filters as we wish to. Okay, so time to test that. If we come back to our form, then we can go into the, where are we posting the locations, copy locations to form. Actually, we're doing the on-change event of the list regions box. So we've got PKID right here, and when we pass the parameters in, what we can do is pass in our array, and our array is going to contain a single string, which is int PKID, so that's our field name. And we'll put equals because we're looking for a specific PKID. Actually, I've got that wrong. We're looking for int FK regions because we're doing a search in the locations endpoint for a region with a foreign key that matches the primary key of the regions table. And so then we need to pass in our PKID, which is going to be int to string, and we'll pass in PKID, and that's our filter string right there. So let's go ahead and see if that works. If we run the application, and there we have our regions, and if I click on the North Austin region, we have some location on that region. So remember that regions are effectively routes. So this is the North Austin route, and we have location 1 on the North Austin route being some location. But if I click on the South Austin, we get no results. And that's because we now have the ability to filter our read method. Okay, so let's go ahead and put in at least a little of the error checking that we've been looking for. I'm going to go over to the CRUD client standard, and on this call to execute here, we want to trap any errors that might happen. Now, one thing that I've noticed is an exception does get raised within this execute method, but the exception is trapped within the execute method. So there's not really much we can do. We don't get any feedback from this call. Now, the REST class actually does have an event for if you're making an asynchronous call with the REST request. It has a HTTP error or HTTP protocol error event handler. But we've implemented our own asynchronous model here, and so I don't really want to go trapping the event handler. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to check the status of the request, and if the status of the request is anything other than 200, then we have an error. So I'm going to say if our request.response.status code is not a 200 being a successful HTTP request. Our request, thank you IDE for doing that for me. If our request.response.status code is not 200, then begin. And then we're going to go ahead and call do read fail. And let's pass in a really generic error message for now. Connection, what am I doing? Connection failed. Okay, and we'll exit out of here, because if we don't exit out at this point, then having called this event, we'll continue to try to parse the array, which is what's been, this causes access violations. We saw one of those in the previous video. So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save and run this code, but before we do, we need to handle the fail condition. So handle read fail, we'll do a show message, and at some point we'll change this later, but for right now let's show the error that we get back. And we also need to do something to this code to make sure that an error happens. So up here where I have the C locations endpoint, I'm going to just temporarily change that to X locations. So our regions endpoint should work just fine, but when we try to read the locations endpoint, the endpoint doesn't exist. We should get an exception and handle it. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Okay, and we have our regions. So I'm going to click on North Austin, and we get this HTTP protocol exception. Now this is being trapped by the debugger in the IDE. This wouldn't happen at runtime for our end users. So we'll go ahead and click continue, and we get connection failed and this rather ugly heading here. So that just demonstrates that we've now got an error trap. Now I think what I'm going to do is first fix the code. Within our PHP for the endpoint, there are certain occasions where we return an error status. We've returned an error message. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and modify that PHP so that actually a HTTP status error is returned, because that'll just unify the error handling into one system. So what we will be able to do later when we've made that change is take a look at the status code that comes back. Maybe we can use a custom status code, or maybe we can pass out the error message in the message body. But generally, I don't really want to pass that error information on to our end user. I just want to tell them the connection failed. And actually, what I'm also going to do is, if for any reason the connection should fail, it would be nice to have a retry, and we can look at adding that in later. But what I would rather do for right now, and I'm struggling to find the method here, read fail. What I would rather do right now is a little bit drastic. I'm going to go for application terminate. So effectively the error message will say connection failed. Let's add application must close. And so then the user will see the application disappear, having sent that message. Let's go ahead and test that real quick. So again, we have our regions, and if I click one of them, we get our error message, application connection failed, application must close, okay, and the application goes away. Now, like I said, at some point, I'm going to go ahead and put something in. Possibly, I'm going to go and put in some retry code, or at least before we get to this read fail handler, maybe make the request try 2 or 3 times. Because obviously this is not an ideal situation, but if the connection is lost and that is not a temporary situation, then the application simply can't continue to function, and to allow it to get past this point would potentially leave it in an errored state. So let me explain what I mean by that before we finish up here. If I have selected one of my regions and an error has happened while we're fetching the locations back, well then the locations box has no entries in it. But this selection hasn't changed. It will still have the same region selected. So as far as the end user is concerned, they saw an error message and the locations didn't come up. But the application thinks, in inverted quotes, that the locations were returned because we didn't bomb out when we had the error code. So that leaves us in an errored state. Now in that one situation, it probably wouldn't be too bad. We just click on another region and the locations will come up if the connection is restored. But there are cases where that could leave our UI in a state that it doesn't know what state it's in. And as a consequence, further errors could happen off of the back of that. So I think it's best if all else fails, to tell the user that we're going to bomb out of the application, and then to go ahead and bomb out as we have done here. But of course, like I said, I don't want that to happen on the very first error. I'm going to put some retry code in the CRUD client in a later video. So, okay, I think that's enough for this video. We've done a quick review of the code that I added the locations endpoint, added some error checking, and even added filters to our read method. So if all goes according to plan, in our next video, we should start filling out some of the other CRUD methods. Let's take a look at building out the create method, for example, so that we can add our own regions and locations. So once again, my name's Craig Chapman. Thanks for watching, and until next time.